mysterious interstellar visitors, and the earliest size estimates were built on limited data with real acknowledged uncertainty baked in from day one. It wasn't until NASA's Hubble Space Telescope got a clean, focused look in late July and August of 2025 that astronomers could narrow the estimate meaningfully, pinning the nucleus somewhere between roughly 440 meters and 5.6 kilometers across. That is still a wide range, not a precise number, because a comet's visible glow is mostly a surrounding cloud of dust and gas, rather than the solid body underneath. just uncovered a truth institutions didn't want you to know, even though the first sentence is the